Hello, this is Ruimy, and my special population is children with autism spectrum disorder. Generally speaking, autism spectrum disorder, the general definition is that it is a neurodevelopmental disorder, and there are differences in communication, the presence of restricted interests and repetitive behaviors that go into diagnosing autism spectrum disorder, and especially differences in social communication that need to be considered when working with a client in the exercise science field who has autism. So there is a spectrum for autism, and depending on where the client falls in the spectrum is how much support they need on a day-to-day basis. And that can be really important in terms of determining progression of exercise prescription, what testing methods to choose, what exercises to choose in the prescription program. There are going to be aspects of interpersonal communication that are not fully developed in children that have autism. Specifically, they might not be able to reciprocate nonverbal communication. So in terms of going about demonstrating exercise testing and prescription exercises, how would those explanations change? And when a client cannot respond to you using facial expressions, how as a professional do you learn how to interact with your client based on their communication abilities and needs? So in terms of diagnostic criteria, in criteria A, the really highlighted piece of information here that is important to exercise prescription and testing is when it comes to nonverbal communication. That can mean an inability to understand gestures and facial expressions. So when the client is communicating to you while exercising, they might not communicate the same as a neurotypical child, and that needs to be considered prior to going into exercise testing and prescription. Also, tone of voice might be different. So again, it is really important to understand, does your client with autism, does your child with autism have the ability to understand nonverbal communication or not? And if they don't, how are you going to ensure that they are still comprehending your instruction without that? In criteria B, the insistence of sameness to adherence or routine is something that can actually be used to benefit in the exercise prescription field, or exercise science field. The progression of your prescription can be very sensitive to this routine, insistence for routine. So as long as the client is being desensitized to a level of variability at an appropriate time, they are likely going to want to adhere to exercise because of its routine in nature and routine. But some considerations to make are, if the client has visualized patterns, or that might involve hyper or hypo reactivity, would that make the exercise environment unsafe? Also, finally, if the client has fixated interests, can I tailor that fixated interest to my exercise program? For example, if a client has the current fixated interest on a professional athlete, can I mimic my exercises? Can I have my exercises mimic the movement patterns of the sport that professional athlete is involved in? Can I progress my client to be able to participate in that sport on a more recreational level? In this final category for criteria, really the only thing that is important to note here is that a common comorbidity that can occur with autism is catatonia. So that would disrupt their ability to be aware of the current environment. So for children who have autism, this can be expressed in a mixed format, which means, for example, a child with autism could be expressing the hyperkinetic behavior of aggression, or they could be expressing the hypokinetic behavior of just not interacting with the environment at all, refusing to speak, little to no facial expression whatsoever. So this diagnostic criteria from the DSM-5 is really important to reference in terms of formulating exercise prescriptions and also structuring exercise testing to be sensitive to where specifically the client may be experiencing more notable elements of these criteria. Pre-participation and exercise testing. So some of the special considerations to be made when going through the pre-participation screening is that there needs to be an emphasis on discussion of client needs. The formalities are typically the same as it would be for a neurotypical child, but in terms of gaining that pertinent information from the parent or guardian about sensory-specific needs, environment preferences. So this can include, more specifically, does this child thrive in environments that have lots of sensory input or not? Then in this case, is music something that the client likes and enjoys, or is it completely a dysregulating input to have? Should I be deciding to choose my exercise prescription modalities to be more of an indoor activity or an outdoor activity? Can I use various forms of equipment, or is that not appealing for the client? Also, preferred reinforcement methods can be utilized to assist with exercise adherence, long-term and short-term, especially at the time if a client is getting dysregulated. Using a preferred method of reinforcement could put the client back on track. And then finally, an assessment of communication development. Re-emphasizing that interpersonal interaction with the client is really, really critical to ensure that the client is building rapport, you are building rapport with the client, and that the client trusts you to familiarize them with the exercise environment and desensitize them to it. Especially with the child needs to be able to trust you, and to trust that that this is a safe environment that they're going to be exercising in. So for exercise testing methods and tools to use recommended by the ACSM, this can also be implemented for prescriptions, but using things such as social narrative, desensitizing a child to the environment and breaking down what an environment, a typical exercise environment would look like, both inside and outside. Task analysis and modeling. These two can go hand in hand. One tool can break down the specific movements in an exercise, or especially compound exercises, and modeling, video demonstrations, right, for specific exercises, or maybe hands-on modeling, allowing the child to perform a bodyweight version of an exercise, or watch you do it first and then you do it with the child. If integrating a tactile experience is something that's going to be beneficial for the client with autism to fully comprehend each exercise and be able to perform it with proper technique and safety, that's going to be really important to use those tools. And finally, branching off of that, prompting tools, if you're ever using prompting tools, such as a metronome, to allow the client to hear the sound of the metronome, and is that something that's productive for the exercise environment or not. The metronome is going to be predictable and rhythmic. It'll be important for the client to be able to hear for themselves when the cueing is going to be happening.